The summer sun was barely breaking through the trees when I noticed something strange on the gravel path leading to my guest cabin. A suitcase, large, scuffed, and planted in the dirt like it had been dragged in haste. The cabin door, usually shut tight, hung open just enough for a breeze to rattle its frame. I hadn't left it that way. The property had always been my sanctuary. Tucked against the lake with a view most people only dreamed about, the guest cabin stood a short distance from my main house. It was meant for family, friends, and the rare visitor I trusted. Never for strangers. Certainly not for uninvited neighbors. But that morning, silence carried a different weight. Birds hushed. The stillness pressed in, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. When I stepped closer, I saw the faint glow of a lamp flicker against the curtain inside. Someone was there, living there. It didn't take long to spot her car. A shiny, spotless SUV parked right across my garden, as if the space belonged to her. That red blazer draped across the passenger seat left no doubt. Karen, the HOA president, the woman who had spent months policing mailbox paint, lawn heights, and the sound of children's laughter, she had moved in. Without permission. Without shame. Most people would have stormed up to the door, demanded answers, maybe even called the sheriff. But this wasn't just a neighbor trespassing. Something felt off. The car was too neat, the cabin too quickly occupied, and Karen too confident. She acted as if she owned it. What she didn't know was that the guest cabin wasn't just sitting empty. Days earlier it had been rented quietly, discreetly, to a federal agency. And the people who were supposed to be inside weren't vacationers. They weren't casual guests. They were FBI. What Karen had stepped into wasn't a stolen getaway. It was a trap she had built with her own entitlement. And before the day was over, her arrogance would pull the entire neighborhood into a storm none of them were ready for. The suitcase on the gravel looked like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I hadn't written. It sat square in the ruts my truck made each winter, a scuffed rectangle of someone else's urgency, the canvas slick with dew that had not yet burned off in the mild, slanting sun. Farther up the path, the guest cabin held its breath. A lamp glowed behind a drawn curtain, soft and domestic, the kind of light that suggested a body had already settled into the corners and decided the space was theirs. The door was left in that careless gap that the wind likes to test, as if the room itself were asking permission to be occupied. This property had rewarded discipline. The lake did not tolerate rashness. It swallowed noise and returned a reflection. Over the years I had learned to notice small things and to treat them like alarms. A twig snapped where no one should be walking. A ripple that moved against the breeze. A scent on the air that didn't belong to pine or water. That morning the alarm was not subtle at all. It sat on the gravel, glowing behind a curtain. The two together formed a message that was impossible to misread. The SUV at the edge of my garden completed the picture. Clean, polished, confident in the way some machines can be. It had been parked without care for the sun-baked stones or the tender shoots of rosemary. I had coaxed through a stubborn spring. A red blazer lay draped across the passenger seat, like a flag planted on a hill. The association between the blazer and the board had been hammered into my mind by countless notices printed on heavy paper and slid under my door or tucked into my mailbox. It meant rules delivered with relish. It meant the leader who was more interested in small dominions than neighborly grace. It meant Karen. Storming over would have satisfied a part of me that kept a tally of past trespasses and petty fines. But there are moments when the better play is to become invisible in your own yard. I let the path take me as far as the shadow of the birch, then angled back uphill toward the main house, feeling the old boards of the deck give and return under my feet. Inside the utility closet, the small screen that governed my quiet network of eyes blinked to a life already watching. The guest cabin came up in crisp rectangles, the porch view that captured the steps and the handrail, the entry view that caught the threshold and anything crossing it, the living room view that respected privacy in normal times, but now felt like a seat in a theater where the wrong play had begun. She had arrived early. The suitcase had appeared first, eased off the back of the SUV, and was left on the path as if to mark intent. A second trip brought the red blazer, slung over a shoulder with purpose. The door had not resisted. I watched her palm the knob, hesitate, push, and then I watched the brief half-turn of her head, the survey of a general who believes the map and the terrain are the same thing. The lap had been switched on with a practice gesture, and then the curtain drawn against the lake as if the water were an adversary. There were other angles beyond my own. In the weeks leading up to this morning, strangers had walked my path with the courtesy of ghosts. They had not worn the kind of shoes that announce arrivals. They had parked out of sight and approached the guest cabin with a mathematical calm that placed weight where floor joists would tolerate it, and shadows where they would dissolve into each other. Their presence had been paperwork, briefcases, a metal case that hummed quietly when the air was still, and a set of simple requests that had made sense. Keep the cabin free, keep a low profile, keep records of anything unusual, and do not chase the unusual. The arrangement had been discreet because it needed to be. Use of the cabin had been reserved because the person it would shelter could vanish only in places that looked stubbornly ordinary. Now the ordinary had been hijacked by a force that didn't know it was playing near a cliff edge. I watched the minutes unfold. She moved like a person convinced of rights no one had given her. A list appeared in her hand, clipped to a board, the paper stiff with resolve. She opened cabinets and nodded at what she found. She set a coffee mug on the counter and claimed the sound that pottery makes against old wood. She stepped out onto the porch and made a call. I could not hear, the tilt of her chin telegraphing a demand to the air. Then she surveyed the yard and the lake with a proprietary satisfaction that reached all the way to my gut. The cabin itself was small by the standards of the neighborhood's newer constructions, but it was honest. A simple gable roof, cedar siding, a porch with railings built to the code. I could practically recite after so many arguments. Inside, a living room that held sunlight like a promise. A galley kitchen with a window that looked directly at a patch of lake that never fully froze. And a bedroom down a short hallway that smelled faintly of lemon oil and the linen closet's quiet breath. It had been built so that families could spill over and still feel welcome. It had never been built for this. I started the protocol I had been given for contingencies that were not quite emergencies. There was no need for alarms. Alarms create a mess and draw attention. There were ways to signal without sound or spectacle. A message went where it was supposed to go, bearing the polite shape of a routine update, but carrying inside it a bright flare of information. The cameras started saving locally and remotely in duplicate. A small device no bigger than a paperback book, nestled behind a tile in the hallway, began a compressed stream designed to slip through crowded air unnoticed. The house filled with the soft industry of systems doing what they were meant to do. Outside, a delivery van nosed up to the turnoff by the mailbox that bore my name. Two men in work shirts handled a flat-packed piece of furniture that would have become a desk if it were given the chance. She met them at the path, waved a hand that dismissed caution, and led them like a parade marshal down to the cabin. They carried the boxes inside and then re-emerged, eyes on the lake as if its distance could explain their presence in my morning. She signed something with a flourish, and the van retreated in a three-point turn that scattered gravel and left the air briefly tasting like hot rubber. The cabin's lamp changed from the amber of one bulb to the insistence of two. It was a routine move for her, this occupation with paperwork. The association liked to believe its covenants gave access to places it did not own, and it had learned to pressure whoever would listen into compliance. A contractor could be told a lockout was an emergency. A locksmith could be persuaded with a card and letterhead. A homeowner could be beaten down by the frequency of demands until the line between suggestion and law blurred under fatigue. I had been told by more than one neighbor that resistance was a project, not a moment. But projects can be managed, plans can be built. In the quiet of the kitchen, I lay out what a day might look like, if it stayed within the rails. The protected person was scheduled to arrive under the cover of the sort of evening that pulls color out of the pines and replaces it with the blue that arrives without warning. Two unremarkable vehicles would use the rear service road that most people in the neighborhood believed was an old fire trail to nowhere. The cabin would become a harbor for a handful of hours, and then the night would fold around it and the morning would deliver nothing but footprints where no one had seen feet move. The next day, life on the lane would find its noise levels again, and the lake would keep a secret it had been told to hold. That was the plan. Plans are perfect until they meet other people's certainty. I printed what needed to be tangible in a world that still respects paper when it is heavy and embossed. The deed that drew a simple rectangle around the earth I was responsible for. The rentals ledger showed the guest cabin status as occupied by a lawful party, whose name looked as boring as any short-term renters. The notices I had received from the association, which, read together on a table, suggested a fixation with my property that could pass for obsession if anyone with a badge looked closely. The screen of my system showed the cabin becoming a home for someone who had not earned it. A pair of shoes appeared by the door. A set of toiletries took their places by the sink. A book with an elastic band around its cover landed on the coffee table as if it had lived there for years. On the lake, a paddleboarder cut a silent path, knees slightly bent against the small chop, posture easy and unaware. Ducks stitched brief commas into the surface, and then erased them by changing course. A cloud crossed the sun and sharpened the edges. Somewhere a mower started, and then stopped, its aggressive snarl replaced by the thin insistence of a string trimmer. The neighborhood resumed its background music, and within that score, a single, wrong note kept ringing. Entitlement does not blend, it broadcasts. By early afternoon, the SUV had been supplemented by a second car. I recognized as belonging to the association's social committee chair, a person who enjoyed standing near power the way some people enjoy standing near heaters in winter. She did not exit the vehicle, but she made a point of idling at the base of the path, long enough for the engine's hum to become a message. The cabin swallowed her gaze and returned nothing. After a while she left, and the quiet returned as if it had been waiting for a cue. I walked the boundary lines that lived in my head and on my maps. The survey stakes sat where they always had, modest and firm. The brush along the southern fence had thickened into a natural barrier that kept most curiosity at bay. The sign on the post at the turnoff announced private property, in the polite, legally sufficient language my counsel had chosen to avoid theatrics. Nothing about the perimeter had changed except the knowledge that came with seeing your space treated like a stage set that everyone else believed they could enter. As the day lengthened, the light grew warmer and more forgiving, painting even the SUV with something like grace. The lamps inside the cabin held steady. No blinds were raised. No windows were open. It is difficult to pretend to belong when you are afraid to let the air touch you. And yet the performance continued. I let the minutes pass and felt each one like a weight added in a precise rhythm to a scale that would eventually tip. There are moments in any contest when both sides believe they are winning. Those are the dangerous minutes, the ones in which people make choices that cannot be walked back. Dusk decided on the color palette without asking anyone's opinion. The trendline darkened into a single silhouette, and the lake gathered up the last gold and spread it thin across itself. From my kitchen I could see the first pinpoint of a headlight far back on the service road, a small star threading through trees where no stars lived. It moved slowly, as if counting breaths. The second pinprick appeared a measured distance behind the first. The plan had not disappeared just because someone else had written herself into the margins. The night itself was arriving, and with it the part of the day when truth travels in pairs and carries its own light. I straightened the stack of papers on the table and checked the small devices that had become a private choir. The signals were clean. The angles were covered. The cabin glowed on the screen with a steady confidence that felt like someone else's line. On the porch, the suitcase had been brought inside. On the path, there were now footprints that did not match the pattern of my boots. At the base of the hill, 2 points of light moved like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence that was finally about to be written by the right hands. The morning that revealed Karen's intrusion into the guest cabin had been shocking, but it did not arrive without precedent. For months, if not years, the battle between property and association had simmered like an old kettle left too long on a low flame. The guest cabin was more than wood and nails. It was the culmination of quiet choices made against the noise of conformity. To build something that simple, that personal, and still have it challenged by people who valued rules over humanity was the kind of irony that twists in a man's chest. The HOA had always believed itself to be a sovereign kingdom. Its bylaws were crafted in a language that mimicked the authority of law, but thrived on ambiguity. Lawn heights, mailbox paints, holiday decorations, each became a weapon when wielded by hands eager to control, and Karen's hands were always busy. She had weaponized petty grievances until they became her currency, trading them for influence among neighbors who were too tired to fight or too polite to resist. What began as friendly reminders evolved into fines, warnings, and inspections that arrived unannounced. She thrived in this role because she needed the illusion of command more than she needed companionship. I had resisted her before. Letters written in sharp but careful language. Evidence gathered to show compliance when she accused otherwise. Conversations were cut short when she pushed past the bounds of courtesy. Each encounter added weight to the invisible wall I had built around my property. Yet despite my diligence, she kept pressing. She had tried to ticket my fence for being too rustic, demanded I remove a boat trailer parked in my own drive, and even once suggested that my guest cabin required association approval to remain standing. None of those battles had gone her way, but each had marked me as an opponent in her eyes, a man who would not yield. The underlying struggle was larger than a cabin or a lawn. It was about sovereignty. Who truly owned space in a neighborhood where signatures on a paper claimed equal power with deeds and titles? Karen believed the HOA was an empire, and she its ruler. I believed that property, earned and kept, was not subject to moods and politics. The clash was inevitable. The cabin, perched at the lake's edge, became the battlefield. In recent months, my world has become further complicated. The arrangement with the FBI was born of a quiet threat between agencies and citizens, who could provide cover without raising suspicion. The guest cabin was the perfect shell, remote yet accessible, ordinary yet secluded. When approached about hosting an operation brief and discreet, I had agreed with the understanding that my role was minimal. Keep it ready, keep it clean, and keep away. The agency would manage the rest. It was a partnership of silence, and I valued silence. But Karen did not. Her life fed on intrusion. She inserted herself into events not meant for her, conversations that did not concern her, and decisions that bore no consequence on her own home. The void she feared most was irrelevance. That fear made her dangerous. Because a person terrified of being ignored will trample boundaries to be noticed. And now, in her hunger to matter, she had stepped directly into a world that required secrecy, patience, and the kind of caution she had never practiced. Underlying all of this was a tension invisible to the casual eye. My property was not simply a retreat. It was a line in the sand between independence and control. To yield here was to admit that private spaces could be claimed by committee signatures and gossip. To resist meant endless war with neighbors who valued harmony at any cost. And in the background, federal work quietly unfolded, tethered to the cabin by threads of necessity. Karen's intrusion was not just an offense against me. It was a collision of worlds. She thought she was trespassing into leisure, that the cabin was a prize she could seize for a weekend of borrowed authority. What she had walked into was a structure woven into a federal operation, a place where identity and safety were shielded by ordinary appearances. The mismatch between her arrogance and the reality inside those walls would become the turning point of the entire neighborhood. That day, as I watched her claim the cabin through the sterile eyes of the cameras, I felt the weight of the struggle shift. It was no longer about notices in the mailbox or fines that could be ignored. It was about exposure. The secrecy of the FBI's use of my cabin was not just my responsibility. It was a matter of national stakes. Karen's entitlement was now a fuse, and every entitled step she took inside that cabin burned it shorter. Neighbors had whispered before about Karen's excesses. Some pitied her, others feared her. But no one had truly believed she could overstep into something larger than property disputes. To them, she was a nuisance, a petty dictator of lawns and shutters. Only now did I see the scale of her hunger for control. Only now did I recognize that her obsession with me had always been reaching for a bigger stage. She had found it, though not in the way she imagined, and beneath it all lay a personal truth I could not ignore. I had underestimated her. I thought her intrusions would stop at threats, fines, and gossip. I thought the cabin would be safe so long as I kept my paperwork precise and my property line clear. I had not counted on her boldness to take physical form, to turn the knob, to walk through the threshold, and declare my space hers. That miscalculation was costly, not just for me but for the strangers whose safety now depended on the secrecy she threatened to unravel. As the sun dipped lower and the evening shadows stretched across the lake, I realized this was not just another round in an old feud. This was an escalation. The HOA had always been a war of paper. Karen had turned it into a war of presence, and presence, once established, is far harder to erase. I stood at the edge of my land, the weight of these struggles pressing from all sides. Between property right and association rules, between silence and exposure, between entitlement and law. The cabin glowed in the dusk, no longer just a building. It was a stage where the clash of control and secrecy would soon play out. And every player, Karen, the HOA, the FBI, and I, was already in position. Bought it with cash I'd saved, and dreams I'd buried for decades. Night carried with it a strange weight on the property. The lake darkened into a sheet of polished obsidian, reflecting only what dared to shine above it. The woods around the cabin gathered into a single mass of shadow, swallowing details until only the vague silhouette of trunks and branches remained. In that heavy quiet, the presence of someone uninvited was sharper, almost invasive, like a single discordant note inside an otherwise perfect silence. As I watched from the main house, a tide of emotions began to creep through me in waves, each one reshaping how I viewed the moment. Fear was first, the instinctive awareness that something larger than property lines was at stake, the FBI's trust in me, the responsibility I had assumed when I agreed to house their operation, and the fragility of secrecy. All of it now rested against the careless entitlement of one woman who believed rules bent toward her whims. Fear made me cautious, but it also lit a fire of responsibility deeper than any HOA fine or threat had ever managed to spark. Anger followed, quieter but heavier. This was not the sudden rage of a man whose fence had been reticentious, or whose mailbox color had been questioned. This was the slow, smoldering fury of someone who had been tested one too many times. Karen's intrusion was not an isolated mistake. It was the culmination of every small trespass she had made into my life. Every petty demand, every notice tucked under my door like a summons. She had stepped without hesitation into the one place she should never have dared to claim. The cabin was not simply mine. It was a trust I was safeguarding. In violating that, she had violated more than property. She had violated responsibility. Yet, beneath the fear and anger lay something softer. Pity. Watching her move around the cabin on the surveillance feed, arranging her suitcase, adjusting the lamp, pacing as though she were rehearsing a performance for an unseen audience. I saw the shape of her loneliness. Entitlement was her armor, arrogance her shield. But beneath it all, she was a woman who feared irrelevance. She filled the silence of her own life with rules and control, convinced that the HOA presidency was a crown rather than a chore. She was not only trespassing into my cabin, she was trespassing into meaning, desperate to carve a place where she mattered. And in her desperation, she had stumbled into something far larger than herself. The emotional bridges forming within me created an uncomfortable duality. On one side was the urge to see her crushed by the weight of her arrogance, to let the federal agents arrive and confront her with the full force of what she had invaded. On the other side was the recognition that Karen was not a mastermind villain. She was a flawed human, blind to the scale of what she had stepped into. To expose her recklessly would not only bring her downfall, it might unravel the very operation meant to stay hidden. The FBI did not thrive on spectacle. They thrived on shadows, and a scandalous neighborhood drama would shine far too much light where none was welcome. As these emotions collided, the struggle shifted inward. Responsibility no longer meant simply protecting the cabin. It meant managing the delicate balance between secrecy and justice, between punishment and preservation. Every choice carried consequences. If I called the sheriff, the intrusion would be documented, but so would the cabin's peculiar use. If I confronted her myself, the situation could spiral into accusations of harassment or threats, and the HOA would rally to her side, blind to the larger picture. If I waited, trusting the FBI's arrival to resolve matters quietly, I risked Karen digging deeper, perhaps stumbling into the very equipment or files that should never be seen by someone like her. I realized that the battle was no longer between me and Karen alone. It was within me, the bridge between my duty to protect the operation and my simmering desire to see justice served for years of her torment. One path required patience, restraint, and trust. The other demanded retaliation, exposure, and the satisfaction of seeing her arrogance shattered. Each emotion pulled me in its direction, and I walked the length of my house like a pendulum, torn between outcomes that felt both right and dangerous. In quieter moments of reflection, I found myself wondering about the neighbors who had long suffered her reign of pettiness. Some had bent under her rules, others had fought in small ways, but all had endured. What would they think if they knew the truth, that the woman who fined them for overgrown lawns or unapproved shutters had stumbled into a federal safe house? Would they cheer her downfall? Would they recoil at the danger she had brought to their doorstep? Or would they, like me, feel the complicated mix of satisfaction and sorrow at seeing a tyrant undone by her own folly? Emotions are rarely clean. They blur into each other, staining decisions with shades of gray. By midnight, as the cabin's light still burned through its curtains and her SUV gleamed under the faint wash of moonlight, I knew that whatever came next would not be simple. Karen's intrusion had built bridges across my heart, between duty and vengeance, between pity and anger, between justice and secrecy. I stood by the window, watching the reflection of the cabin shimmer faintly on the water, and felt those bridges creak under the weight of choice. The struggle was no longer external. It lived inside me, demanding I decide what mattered most: the safety of strangers entrusted to me, or the satisfaction of finally seeing Karen fall. And as the first quiet crunch of tires rolled up the hidden service road, signaling the approach of the ones the cabin was meant to shelter, I realized that choice was no longer mine alone to make. The night was about to deliver its own verdict. The sound of tires on the service road arrived like a whisper first, then grew into a deliberate rumble beneath the canopy of trees. Two vehicles approached in a formation so careful it could almost have been mistaken for casual, ordinary SUVs. Plain colors, no markings, but there was nothing casual about the rhythm of their lights, as they flicked briefly on and off, signaling to unseen watchers that their path was clear. From the vantage of my upstairs window, I saw them roll to a quiet stop in the shadows just beyond the cabin. The headlights cut, leaving only the faint orange glow of running lights before those two disappeared. Doors opened with minimal sound. The figures who stepped out did so with the ease of men who had practiced silence, their movements measured, every glance purposeful. They weren't tourists or renters. They were federal agents arriving exactly as planned. Inside the cabin, Karen's light burned on. She hadn't stirred at the noise. She likely thought her secure, maybe even triumphant in her theft of space. A queen occupying her borrowed kingdom, oblivious to the storm gathering around her. The agents paused only briefly outside, scanning the perimeter with a precision that reminded me of the weeks leading up to this night. They had chosen the cabin because it was ordinary, because its owner blended into the background of lakefront life, because nothing about it drew attention, at least not until Karen made it her stage. Now what should have been a quiet transfer of people and files had become a collision between arrogance and duty. I held my breath as one of the agents gave a subtle hand signal. The team fanned out, two moving toward the rear entrance, one circling wide through the trees. Their intent was clear: secure the safe house before the protected party entered. But the safe house wasn't empty. It was occupied by an intruder who had no idea how dangerous her situation had become. Through the surveillance feed, I watched Karen move about with her usual self-importance, writing notes on her clipboard, fussing with furniture she had no right to touch, adjusting the blinds with a critical squint. To her, this was an act of authority, a claim staked by presence. To the men outside, this was a breach of the very secrecy their work demanded. Two realities now coexisted, and they were about to collide. The tension was no longer confined to my property. By morning, whispers had already begun to thread through the neighborhood. A neighbor walking a dog had slowed by the edge of my driveway, watching the SUV parked in my garden with thinly veiled curiosity. Another had passed on her bicycle, craning her neck toward the glowing windows of the cabin. They wouldn't confront me directly, not yet. But the HOA thrived on curiosity. One spark was enough to ignite gossip into a wildfire. Karen's bold move had not gone unnoticed. It had become a public challenge, one the entire association would rally behind if given the chance. I could already imagine the narrative being spun. Karen, the ever-vigilant president, had reclaimed a cabin she would claim was neglected, unsafe, or misused. She would present her intrusion as duty, not theft. Her allies would echo her story, weaving it into the fabric of association righteousness. And I, the homeowner, would be painted as negligent, irresponsible, even rebellious. In their eyes, Karen wasn't trespassing, she was enforcing order. The very order the HOA believed it existed to uphold. But Karen's story, no matter how loudly she told it, was fragile. It relied on secrecy, on the belief that the cabin was just a cabin, that her trespass was small enough to excuse. The moment the FBI's presence brushed against hers, her illusion would crack. She would not be a hero then. She would be an intruder in a federal operation. A pawn who had wandered onto a board where the stakes were far higher than HOA politics. The agents didn't storm the cabin. They worked with the patience of professionals who had seen worse, who knew that timing mattered more than force. They set their perimeter, exchanged quiet signals, and prepared to make entry not with violence but with inevitability. Watching them move through the screens, I felt the tension rise, not because of what they were about to do but because of how Karen would react. She had built her identity on power she didn't truly have. When stripped of that illusion, what would remain? And yet, a part of me dreaded the public stage this was becoming. The neighbors who had noticed the SUV, the gossip that would ripple through committee meetings, the speculation about why federal-looking men were seen in our quiet neighborhood, all of it threatened to drag a private operation into the harsh light of community scrutiny. Karen's intrusion had shifted the struggle from a private violation to a public spectacle. The challenge was no longer only mine to manage. The entire neighborhood, hungry for drama, had been invited into the conflict. As night deepened, the stage was set. The cabin stood at the center of a storm. Inside, Karen moved with arrogance, scribbling notes and making plans no one had asked her to make. Outside, federal agents moved with discipline, ready to secure the space she had stolen. And beyond them, the neighborhood waited with ears pressed to rumor and eyes fixed on shadows, eager to turn the story into a trial. The battle for property had become a battle for narrative. And as I stood in my darkened home, papers stacked on my table, screens glowing with the evidence of trespass, I understood that what came next would not simply determine the fate of one woman's arrogance. It would shape how every neighbor saw me, the cabin, and the association itself. The rising tension was not just in the air. It was in the eyes of everyone watching. The cabin had always been a place of stillness, a modest retreat that held the smell of cedar and the sound of water lapping against the shore. That stillness shattered the moment the agents moved in. They didn't storm the door, nor did they raise their voices. Instead, they entered with the precision of men accustomed to controlling chaos before it began. Their presence was deliberate, their steps calculated. In the glow of my surveillance screens, I saw Karen's kingdom collapse in real time. At first, she didn't realize what was happening. She was in the kitchen, arranging the contents of her clipboard into neat stacks across my counter, as though categorizing her imagined authority into physical proof. When the back door opened with a whisper and two figures stepped inside, she froze mid-motion. The shock in her body language was immediate, a stiffening of shoulders, a falter of her hands, an unpracticed pause. Her mind searched for explanations, but her pride resisted the simplest one, that she was the intruder, not them. The agents gave no acknowledgement of her authority. They did not treat her like a homeowner or even a neighbor. To them she was a variable, a problem that had to be contained before the protected arrival could proceed. One moved swiftly to check the hallway. Another swept the bedroom, while a third fixed his gaze on Karen, not with hostility but with the cold neutrality of someone trained to measure risk. She tried to speak, her lips moving, but no sound traveled through the feed I watched. Instead, her gestures grew sharper, her clipboard raised like a badge, her finger pointing toward the door as if she could banish them with authority. She did not have. They did not move. The clipboard might as well have been paper against stone. Then came the moment that shifted everything. One of the agents lifted a small black case from his side, opened it on the counter, and laid bare the evidence of who they were. Identification, precise and undeniable, gleamed under the kitchen light. Karen's reaction was visible even through the grain of the camera feed. Her face drained of color, her hand faltered, the clipboard dipped. The shield of authority she had carried for so long cracked in an instant. She wasn't president of anything in that moment. She was a trespasser standing inside a federal operation. But the revelation didn't stay contained within those walls. Outside, life in the neighborhood had its own rhythm, and gossip was already circling like hawks above a field. A neighbor, the same one who had paused with her dog hours earlier, now lingered at the edge of the lane, her eyes fixed on the unfamiliar movement around the cabin. Another, drawn by curiosity, parked his truck a few houses down, headlights dimmed but his gaze clear. From where I stood, I could see shadows shifting behind curtains, neighbors peeking, recording, whispering to spouses about the unusual presence of strangers in black jackets. Karen's downfall was not private. It was unfolding under the gaze of the very people who had once yielded to her authority. For years, she had been the enforcer of rules, the wielder of fines, the arbiter of paint shades and mailbox shapes. Now, she was the subject of scrutiny, caught in a position she could not explain away with paperwork or politics. Her enemies watched with satisfaction. Her allies watched with disbelief. The entire balance of neighborhood power shifted in those long minutes of revelation. From my vantage point, the weight of the moment pressed heavily. This was the turning point. I had imagined many ways Karen's reign could falter. Legal battles, committee votes, community uprisings. But never had I pictured her collapse being orchestrated by forces far outside the HOA. It was almost poetic. She had stepped into my cabin to prove her dominion, and in doing so she had exposed herself before the one authority she could neither intimidate nor outmaneuver. The revelation rippled outward. Karen's arrogance had always thrived on secrecy, on whispered threats and closed-door meetings. Now, with neighbors watching and federal agents standing firm, her illusion was shattered in public. The HOA's greatest weapon, perception, was turned against its own leader. The story would spread faster than she could contain it, twisting through living rooms and committee halls until her name was no longer spoken with fear, but with ridicule. And yet, as satisfying as the scene was, it carried its own danger. The FBI thrived on shods, not spectacle. Their presence was never meant to be noticed, let alone witnessed by a neighborhood hungry for gossip. Karen had forced their hand, dragging them into the open. The revelation that crushed her pride also threatened the very secrecy the operation depended on. In her collapse lay a new risk, one that could not be undone simply by sending her away. The agents acted with discipline. They didn't argue, didn't threaten, didn't reveal more than was necessary. They moved her to the porch with quiet efficiency, her protests visible but unheard, her gestures turned frantic, then pleading. But the audience of neighbors made the performance all the more humiliating. What she once wielded as power now looked like desperation, a woman clinging to control she never truly possessed. The night, once a canvas for secrecy, had become a stage for revelation. Karen's identity fractured under the lights of exposure, her authority crumbling as surely as if the ground beneath her feet had given way. The cabin, once her stolen throne, was reclaimed. Not by me, not by the HOA, but by the quiet weight of federal presence. For the first time in years, the neighborhood no longer belonged to Karen's voice. It belonged to silence, to watching eyes, to the heavy truth that she had overstepped so far that even the most loyal could no longer follow. And as I stood in the stillness of my house, the weight of the revelation settled over me. Justice had arrived, but not in the form I had imagined. Karen was undone, but the price of her downfall was exposure. Exposure that might yet ripple beyond the lake, beyond the neighborhood, into places where shadows were meant to hold. The revelation had come, and with it, a new question. How much damage had her arrogance already done? Thought it. Morning came slowly over the lake, light filtering through the trees in streaks of silver and gold. The cabin, once glowing with Karen's self-proclaimed authority, now stood quiet, its windows dark, its door locked once more under hands that understood what secrecy demanded. The agents had moved with efficiency through the night, ensuring the protected guest arrived, was sheltered, and eventually moved on as planned. The operation had survived, though not without bruises. Karen, however, had not. Her confrontation with the agents had been swift and undeniable. There had been no shouting match, no dramatic scuffle. Her authority had dissolved the moment federal credentials touched the counter. She had been escorted out with the kind of detached courtesy professionals extend to a problem they do not wish to escalate. No handcuffs, no flashing lights, no arrest. To the agents, she was not worth the paperwork of spectacle. But to the neighborhood, the image of their HOA president being guided off my porch by strangers in black jackets was enough to redraw every line of influence she had once wielded. By dawn, whispers had already thickened into stories. Some said she had been arrested, others claimed she had been caught breaking into federal property, and a few insisted she was under investigation for fraud. The truth was quieter, simpler, and far more devastating for her. She had been humiliated in front of the very people who once feared her. Neighbors who had endured her fines for weeds or paint shades now watched her with sidelong glances that mixed satisfaction with disbelief. They remembered how she had strutted through committee meetings, wielding bylaws like weapons, her voice sharp with imagined authority. Now they saw her stripped of that image, a woman whose arrogance had carried her into a place she could not control, undone not by rebellion but by her own entitlement. The HOA board convened within days, but the tone was different. The allies who once rallied behind her found their own reputations tainted by proximity. Questions hung in the air. How could their president justify trespassing on private property? What had she been doing in a cabin connected to federal agents? Why had she risked dragging the entire neighborhood into something so dangerous? There were no answers she could give without admitting the truth. And the truth was unthinkable for her pride. Silence became her only shield. But silence in a neighborhood built on gossip is a slow execution. By the end of the week, Karen resigned from her presidency. Officially, it was framed as a personal decision to step back for the well-being of the community. Unofficially, it was the only way to stop the bleeding. Without her authority, the board scrambled to maintain order, but the spell had been broken. The HOA no longer felt like a government. It felt like a committee of neighbors again, stripped of its tyrant. For me, the resolution was quieter, but heavier. The FBI had reclaimed their safe house, thanked me for my cooperation, and left as discreetly as they had come. They reminded me of the importance of silence, that no word of their presence could leave the property, no confirmation be given to curious neighbors. The cover of mystery was as much their protection as it was mine, and so I carried the weight of knowing the truth, while the neighborhood spun stories in the vacuum of fact. Emotionally, the aftermath was not as simple as satisfaction. There was a part of me that thrilled at the sight of Karen's downfall, at the way her empire crumbled under the weight of her own arrogance. But there was also pity. She had lived so long on the illusion of control that losing it stripped her bare. I saw her walking once, days later, down the lane without her usual clipboard, her posture no longer commanding but tentative, as if she were a guest in a neighborhood she had once ruled. No one greeted her, no one waved. Isolation became her punishment. And for someone like Karen, irrelevance was harsher than any fine or jail cell. The moral weight of it all settled in time. The struggle between property and association, between independence and control, had not been won by force or argument. It had been settled by truth. The cabin was mine, not the HOA's. My rights as a property owner were real, not suggestions to be signed away by committee. And Karen's fall proved a lesson louder than any notice or fine could teach. Power borrowed from fear and illusion is fragile. The moment it is tested by reality, it crumbles. The neighborhood changed after that. Not immediately, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that mattered. People were slower to accept HOA demands, quicker to question the authority behind them. Meetings became discussions instead of pronouncement, and though the board continued, its power no longer carried the same sharp edge. The shadow of Karen's downfall hung over every decision, a reminder of how far arrogance could drag a community. For me, the cabin returned to stillness. The lamp once more glowed for family, for friends, for visitors who came with permission instead of entitlement. Yet it held a new gravity now, as if the walls themselves remembered what they had sheltered: the quiet professionalism of agents, the desperation of a woman undone, the turning point of a community reclaiming itself. The moral impact was not just on Karen, or the HOA, or even the neighbors who watched from their windows. It was on me. I had carried resentment for years, built walls of anger against her intrusions. But in the end, it was not my anger that ended her reign. It was her own arrogance. The lesson was simple but enduring. Sometimes the surest justice is to let the prideful write their own downfall. And so, as the lake shimmered under the morning sun and the cabin stood quiet once again, I understood what resolution truly meant. Not the crushing of an enemy, but the restoration of balance. Karen had lost her crown, and in losing it, the neighborhood had gained back its peace. The war was over. Not because I had fought harder, but because truth had proven stronger than illusion.